Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Just delighted to have back with us Tom Joscelyn, who is an investigator extraordinaire and national security expert. And we're going to talk to him about some of the most important and really kind of shocking things that's going on in our national security and justice systems. Welcome, Tom. Great to see you again.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Let's start with Jeanine Pirro. She has been nominated for the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And this, of course, was the position that Ed Martin was nominated for and washed out. Tom Tillis, a member of that Senate Judiciary Committee that initially is going to vote to confirm, said he has a test for nominees. What is that test? And does she pass or fail it?
Yeah, Tillis has said very publicly, and he said it, right as sitting there in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing hall, said that any nominee who has condoned the violence on January 6th in any way won't get past them, won't get past the committee. Well, Jeanine Pirro's done that multiple times and in multiple different ways. One of the things she did, Jen, I saw this on the record, is that she, in her answers to the senators' written questions, she said, I immediately after the attack, I publicly condemned the violence, right? That's true. And if the story ended there and that was all to it, then that'd be a wrap, right? But it is not the full story. In fact, within months, she was making excuses and apologia for the violence. She described anyone who was talking about January 6th being violent. She said that was a political narrative by the Biden administration. She dismissed it. She said that she described the January 6ers as hostages and said that the Department of Justice prosecuted them for their political beliefs. She's claimed that the only victim really on January 6th was Ashley Babbitt, who was shot. And of course, Babbitt was shot by an officer as she was climbing through a door, smashed in door at the lead of the mob that was approaching members of Congress who were being evacuated. She claimed that the U.S. Capitol Police covered that up, and she insinuated that, which is not true. The officer who shot her, had already been on, broadcast television. I think one of the more disturbing things for me is she's also endorsed and defended Trump's sweeping pardons of the January 6ers. She was on an episode of this guy, Sid Rosenberg. You know who he is? This former, sports, radio guy, really obnoxious to listen to, pretty awful, actually. And I had to listen to a show to find this, but she was on his show in January, and Rosenberg asked her, I've had these other guests on, I'm asking them to grade Trump's first week. And, this guy, Rich Lowry from the NRO, National Review, only gave him an A- because he didn't like Trump's sweeping pardons, referring to the January 6ers. And Pirro leans right into it, says A triple plus 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 for Trump. And she goes on and she defends the sweeping pardons. And she calls them hostages, the January 6ers. And this is the thing that got me, as somebody who studied January 6 very carefully. She criticized the sentencing of Enrique Tarrio, the head of the Proud Boys, who he is, as a federal judge, a Trump appointee, has described him accurately as a leader of the conspiracy, as the leader of the conspiracy to attack the U.S. Capitol, who brought battle-hardened men, who brought men ready for battle on January 6th to the Capitol. And she criticized the sentencing of him. So, if Tillis was going to stick to a standard, we know that's a big if, a big capital letters if with asterisks on both sides, above and below, right? If he's going to actually stick to his standard, then he can't possibly let Pirro pass.
And just to remind people, Tom was an investigator on the January 6 committee. So there's no one, and a co-author of the report. So there's no one who understands the ins and outs and who said what about whom, when, than Tom. Another person who has made excuses for January 6 is Emil Bove, who not only has that problem, but has is the subject rather of a whistleblower who has come forward not only to testify, but now with documentation suggesting that he told Justice Department members to blow off the courts, to disregard, direction and orders concerning the deportation of immigrants, illegal deportation, by the way. And of course, he was front and center in the Eric Adams correct bargain. How is it possible that the Republicans put him through the Senate Judiciary Committee?
I would say this is what authoritarianism looks like, right? Emil Bove's career has been one of servitude to Donald Trump, not service to the law. And he very clearly, when he was in an acting position at the Department of Justice, he issued two memos that were basically January 6th apologia. He's failed the Tillis test too, but Tillis won't say that and won't admit that. But Bove issued 2 memos where he cited Trump's words, his memorandum, his executive order, describing the January 6th prosecutions as a grave national injustice. Emil Bove took part in that supposed injustice as a member of SDNY. He prosecuted and he worked on January 6 cases. This is what authoritarianism does, right? It totally warps one's sense of morality and right and wrong in a way that's profoundly troubling. He goes from working on those cases to total servitude to Donald Trump, to repeating this claim that in essence actually undermines the very work he did, and criticizes the very work he did. He also moved to fire prosecutors of the Department of Justice who worked on January 6 cases. He made these moves to compile this list of FBI employees that worked on January 6 cases, which has all sorts of authoritarian undertones because these identities could have been leaked and used against them. I mean, there's all sorts of problems there. So this is a guy who really doesn't belong as a federal judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is a very troubling nomination and a very troubling development that he's probably going to get through, because it just shows how the standards have totally bottomed out.
Now, Susan Collins has already come forward and said she won't support him, but we've been down this road before. Somehow, magically, they always come up with 3 people to object or to disapprove or to vote against something,
but
not
not
a fourth.
Right.
Just one short. Gosh, they missed it by 1. And then the vice president comes in to break the tie. How can, frankly, they look and defend this record when voters ask them about it? Or is the problem that voters don't ask about it and they think they're simply have impunity to vote for whoever Donald Trump tells them to vote for?
Well, I mean, look, a lot of their voters are for voting through these people and bringing them through, right? I mean, this gets to the fundamental problem in our system right now and what's going on. We have 2 political parties. One of them is authoritarian and will do what dear leader says, right? And when you have 2 political parties and one of them is in the bag, you're in trouble. Because it means that there's not going to be any agreed upon standards or rules of the game to abide by. That's what January 6 was all about. That's what all this behavior we've seen since he came back in Trump 2.0 is all about. That's what all this means. We don't have 2 functioning political parties anymore. We have one that's devoted to an authoritarian cult of personality, and we have one that is got its problems, but at least is playing by democratic rules, small d democratic rules. And when you have that type of imbalance, it's very, very difficult to have accountability. It's very difficult, impossible really, to have consistent standards or have any kind of morality or ethics in your judgments. And that's what you're seeing with these nominations, these nominees. You're seeing it just completely slide away.
Now, looming over all of this, of course, is the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. It's really 2 scandals. One is the authoritarian nightmare of an administration continuing a decades-long cover-up of really a group of sexual predators, men who had sex with children. That's what we're talking about, and who enabled
raping
children.
Women. Yep. And not just underage, raping women too. Even of age women were abused and raped by this creep.
Absolutely. And we don't know the identities of all of the men involved. And in fact, we may never know unless the documents are released. So on one hand, you have a democracy crisis, a procedural crisis, that we have an administration covering up for potential sex predators and for enablers of Jeffrey Epstein and for the details behind a sweetheart deal he got back in 2007. So we have that problem. And then, of course, we have these young girls and women who have been through hell and back, but their tormentors have never really suffered anything other than Jeffrey Epstein, Maxwell, who may get now a sweetheart deal of her own, and Prince Andrew. What man has ever suffered any consequence of this? What's your take on how this got to this point and whether this is really finally a crisis point for the democracy movement and whether people can finally put their foot down?
Yeah, I think this hits on a lot of the problems actually with our society and our government. At its root, there was an institutional failure in the Jeffrey Epstein case, right? He was not brought to justice in a swift fashion. Got the sweetheart deal, as you said, which was a ludicrous deal. And by the way, his co-conspirators got great sweetheart deals as part of that too, which is even more astronomically insane, and so it takes years for him to actually be brought to accountability, and then he kills himself under these mysterious circumstances in a federal prison. And only his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, is still in prison to this day. And Department of Justice, and this should concern all of us, is reaching out to Maxwell to talk to her.
Yes.
This is not about bringing justice, right? This is not about getting the facts. This is about cutting a sideways deal to defend Donald Trump, because that's what authoritarian regimes do. But from my perspective, a couple things, right? One, I think people get confused because there's been so much conspiracy mongering around the Epstein ordeal that they don't realize that there actually is a real scandal here, right? There is an actual real conspiracy and a real problem, right, that needs to be addressed. And my view throughout my entire career, no matter what side of the political spectrum I've been working with, has been that transparency is the best disinfectant, right? The best way to deal with these types of conspiracy, these types of problems, is put as much information out there as possible and let the chips fall where they may. And that's my view to this day. Every Epstein file, to me, taking some care to blot out and protect the victims, right? Other than that, the victimizers, I don't care. All the information on them needs to come out. All the people who were involved with this sexual predator and involved in this racket need to come out. All of them, and whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or otherwise. And we were talking right before we got on, Jen. As somebody who's done all sorts of analysis on huge caches of documents throughout his career, the amount of material we have not seen on Epstein is absolutely unbelievable, right? There is an unbelievable amount of information on this. And we saw how just one report in the Wall Street Journal, where, someone gave the Wall Street Journal this birthday card, purportedly written by Trump to Jeffrey Epstein and signed by Donald, where the pubic region of this naked drawing of a woman is, and with a very suggestive note that sort of so they were sharing in their deep, dark secrets, really. Who knew about that until last week? Think about it. We're sitting here in 2025. We've had 3 hotly contentious presidential elections, 3, right? And the Jeffrey Epstein scandal has dominated a lot of the internet discourse and a lot of documentaries and a lot of media for a long time now. And yet we just learned in days that there's this birthday card purportedly written by Donald Trump. Doesn't that tell you how much we don't know? Doesn't that tell you how much we haven't seen so far and how much we should see,
It's astronomical. And I would commend to our contrarian audience that they take a look at an interview that Julie K. Brown did. Julie K. Brown is the fearless reporter for the Miami Herald, who was on this case now for 7, 8 years, who went in and did the digging to find out what the universe of documents are. She wanted to know, how was it that he has escaped detection? What is out there? And she goes through the documents we don't have. There are possible videotapes that Jeffrey Epstein took within his mansion and homes that may reveal identities. We don't have FAA documents that reveal information about his planes or U.S. Marshals who were on the planes. We don't have information concerning his first prosecution and sweetheart deal with Alex Acosta, who, by the way, was nominated for the Secretary of Labor in Trump 1. We don't have documentation about a civil settlement that was reached in Virgin Islands, of all places, after he died, with his estate that had files themselves. We go on and on and on. Hundreds, thousands, we don't even know the extent of it. In your experience, at this point, Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Other than protecting potentially the identities of these girls and women, is there any justification for keeping this stuff secret? How can this not be of the public interest?
I think there's no justification for keeping it secret, because you're looking at, one of the big reasons we have this populist backlash against the elite and against the establishment, both the Republican and Democratic establishment, a backlash that Trump, with all the contradictions and paradoxes built in, rode to power, right? Even though he is swampiest of swamp creatures and he is as corrupt as the day is long. This is what is driving that, right? This is the type of story that's driving that populist backlash, because the bottom line is people smell a rat here, even if some of the stuff they believe is kooky and crazy, right? People smell a rat. They know something is very wrong here. And obviously, for all the reasons you just laid out, there is something very wrong here. So the bottom line is the institutions have not delivered accountability and justice to all the people who were complicit or accomplices of Jeffrey Epstein's network, his prolific network with more than 1,000 women, which I think is a lowball estimate, and young girls, by the way, as victims. That's a massive, sprawling conspiracy in sex trafficking terms. We should know, we should have a real, and the best way to do this is sunshine, right? Have the public actually find out who these people are who did this, who were complicit in his actions.
Absolutely. And, aside from the women and girls specifically, there were people who handled his money. There were people who accepted donations from this guy who like to hobnob against intellectuals and scientists. There were business people. And so there is an entire network. And regardless of whether those people, the entire universe, committed crimes, people have a moral responsibility. People who knew what was going on and did nothing. And for this gang, for this regime, which rode to power on QAnon and on rumors and ridiculous accusations that Hillary Clinton was involved in sex trafficking, for them to now turn a blind eye to this is beyond comprehension. Do you think, as, excuse me, some in the legacy, nearly dead mainstream media do, that this is all going to disappear, that Donald Trump has figured out how to distract people?
I mean, it'll disappear if it's left up to those people to report on it. I mean, like the reporting is so terrible. I mean, there were 3 pieces in the mainstream media citing MAGA loyalists to Trump saying, oh, this is all going to blow over. It's all kosher now. And it was like, there are like 5 people who are all MAGA diehards, and one of whom has actually got his own problems in all this, and Steve Bannon, I mean, it's just totally ridiculous. I mean, to me, you hit on an important point here, which is that Trump rode this type of issue to power. QAnon believes that he's this messianic deliverer. There are millions of QAnon adherents to one degree or another, by millions, right? This is part of what people need to be afraid about. And they believe that he was this messianic figure who was going to deliver us from these types of pedophile sex trafficking rings, right? And this should, and I think it already has produced a little bit of cognitive dissonance, or a lot of cognitive dissonance amongst these people, because now he has been implicated in the very thing that he's supposed to be a messiah against, right? And I think this is the type of thing, the way this would die down is twofold. One, Trump is successful in covering up what it is. And again, we don't know, most of this, we don't know what actually transpired here in terms of him or in terms of other individuals. We have to find out. And two, if it's left to legacy media to kind of report on this stuff. You mentioned Julie Brown earlier, right? She did not somebody who had the resources of one of these major news organizations when she was doing this. She was at a paper, I think in Miami, right? Big paper, but not, but she didn't have some huge team to help her, dig into this massive conspiracy, and yet she did. And that's how things work nowadays. And so it's up to, I think, the new direct media, like the Contrarian, like New Places, to keep this type of thing going, to keep it alive, to keep people reporting on it, because you can't count on these journalists to do it when they're going to say, oh, Steve Bannon says it's not a problem anymore. No problem. Move on,
It really is stunning. And I think the other way, obviously, to keep on is the political ramifications. The House of Representatives literally ran out of town today because they didn't want to deal with this. They stopped business. They left the Capitol because they're so afraid of having to take a vote or someone discuss this. Now, they're going to go back to their districts, and maybe they're going to hide under their desks, but at some point they have to pop their heads up and they have to face their voters. Should they be confronted politely, peacefully, but nevertheless confronted at every turn? Why are you covering up? Why are you not making the names and the documents and all of the information we have public? Can't the public at this point weigh in with these people?
You would hope so. I mean, this is testing, again, the elasticity of MAGA believers, right? I mean, what they've shown to date is that they're incredibly elastic, and they will make whatever excuses they need to make for Donald Trump. They blame the FBI for January 6th. You confront them with the mountain range of evidence about Trump's corruption, and they'll say, well, Hunter Biden's laptop. It's all about whataboutism and excuses and grievances and victimology. It's all sick stuff, right? This is the type of story that you would hope would finally pierce that cocoon. We often talk about the right-wing echo chamber. That's a phrase I've used too. I actually recently I've thought, this isn't an echo chamber. That's way too soft of a word. It's a cocoon. These people live in a cocoon, right? Where they do not let any kind of facts come in at all that may upset their snowflake ideology. And so here we have a very disturbing fact by the Wall Street Journal. Perhaps there are other disturbing facts in the files. Hopefully they will call for all the disturbing facts against whoever, whether it be Democrat, Republican, Trump, or others. Who cares? Let the chips fall where they may. That's what these people should be calling for. That's what they claim to want. That's what they claim to say that the government is complicit in, and why they're opposed to the government that has existed now for over the last 10 years, let's say, with these talking about Jeffrey Epstein and how they've been vehemently opposed to the government's actions. This is what they claim they want. So hopefully they just stick true to that.
Absolutely. And let me leave with a little bit of advice for my friends back in the legacy/zombie media. When you're interviewing a Republican and they change the topic to some cock and bull story about Barack Obama, you do not follow them down that rat hole. You say, stop. What you're saying is a lie. I asked you about Jeffrey Epstein. Answer the question. And they seem incapable of doing that. Maybe we should hire Tom Joscelyn and a bunch of plaintiffs' lawyers to be on-screen anchors and interviewers, because these people seem entirely incapable of confronting. And it's like automatic. Ron Johnson comes on, ask a question. Now we're talking about Obama. Mike Johnson comes on. Now we're talking about Obama. Like, how many times do they fall for this?
Well, I mean, it goes to central asymmetry. I know we're wrapping up here, but this is a bigger conversation, I think, in terms of what's happened here, that the right has built this cocoon media that is constantly on the attack, right? They're constantly savaging the left. They're constantly savaging Democrats. They're constantly savaging the mainstream media. They're constantly attacking their enemies and creating excuses for Donald Trump. And there is not a type of media like that on the center left side, right? Holistically. I mean, there are a few outlets that do a good job of keeping the light on the truth in certain things, like the Contrarian, like a few others, right? But there's not this vast sort of array and network of podcasters and people who are constantly on the attack and constantly doing this sort of thing. And the mainstream media is not going to do that. The mainstream media does, quite frankly, does a lot of great reporting, a lot better reporting than the center-right cocoon, the MAGA media cocoon, definitely, right? But overall, they're not equipped to handle a moment like this, where so much of the media now, and this new media, is explicitly partisan, is incredibly tribal and partisan, and is constantly on the attack. And their kind of response to that is basically, we don't know what to do, and Steve Bannon is right, the Jeffrey Epstein story is going to go away. Okay, I mean, if that's what you call reporting, then I don't know what to say,
And maybe that explains why the legacy media is becoming the zombie media, is becoming the unwatched media and unwatchable media. Tom, I can't thank you enough. You are such a font, not only of information and granular detail, but of the big picture. And in all of this detail, we have to keep our eye on the big picture. This is about democracy. It's about authoritarianism. This is about losing the capacity to understand and believe in the truth. So thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for being one of the most contrarian of the contrarians. We love you. And we'll look forward to our next chat.
Thanks, Jen.
Take care.